Downing Street and law breaking. What are the precedents? On the 29th of March 2022, yesterday as I speak, we learn that 20 fines will be issued, fixed penalty notices will be issued as part of the police inquiry into parties taking place at Downing Street that violated COVID lockdown rules. We won't know exactly who those fixed penalty notices will be issued to, although we've been told that we will find out if the Prime Minister or the Cabinet Secretary have had fixed penalty notices issued to them. At the time of speaking, of recording, neither of them have, we've been told, had fixed penalty notices, but potentially that could change. The investigation isn't yet complete. This is an important event for many reasons, but also from a historical sense in that it would seem to be unusual, perhaps unique, for people to be found to have broken the law in the workplace at number 10 in this way. There doesn't seem to be a clear precedent for this, for number 10 or other Downing Street staff to have actually broken the law while they're working there as part of their job, their day-to-day job. It's unusual, but are there any precedents? How exceptional is it? I'm going to go back through in reverse chronological order some examples that help us to assess the significance of it. First thing I'd say is 20 is quite a lot of fixed penalty notices. It may be that 20 different people didn't get them. We don't know exactly who did get them, but it's quite a significant number. It's not just one violation of the law. It's 20 violations of the law, at least, perhaps more to come. So that's significant. And some of the cases I'm about to talk about involve potentially, or one case in particular, involves only one person. Two cases, in fact, involve only one person. Others involve more than one people being suspected of things, but the actual prosecutions, successful prosecutions I'm going to talk about, involve only one person, whereas these 20 fixed penalty notices seem to involve more than one person taking place, or clearly do. So if we go back first to July 2014, Andy Coulson, who had been Director of Communications to David Cameron, first when David Cameron was Conservative leader of the opposition from 2007, and then from 2010 to David Cameron as Prime Minister. Coulson stepped down in 2011 as he started to come under scrutiny for his involvement in the phone hacking scandal during his time when he had been editor of the News of the World, a now closed down title that was associated with this particular scandal. Coulson, therefore, had been involved in this before he joined Cameron's staff in 2007 and had resigned as editor of the News of the World, but had not been prosecuted for his involvement in what had taken place. However, the scandal in various ways revived, and by July 2014, Coulson was found guilty for his involvement in phone hacking and sentenced to 18 months in prison. So that's a clear example of someone who had been a member of staff of a Prime Minister and who was actually given a prison sentence for criminal activities. However, the thing which he had done, for which he was imprisoned, had taken place before he actually got the job as for David Cameron and before he became an aide at number 10 Downing Street. So there's a slight distinction there from the case we're talking about today. Nevertheless, it's a significant precedent, I think, as someone connected to a Prime Minister also being involved in a serious offence. If we go back to the previous decade before that, in 2006-2007, the Metropolitan Police carried out an extensive investigation into allegations about the supposed improper sale of honours. This investigation questioned various Number 10 staff and the Prime Minister himself, but in the end, it found insufficient evidence for the Crown Prosecution Service to actually charge anyone. In fact, the only case of someone being successfully prosecuted for the sale of honours came much earlier, and that was in 1933 when Maundy Gregory was found guilty on this count. Gregory had acted as a deal maker for prime ministers, including perhaps most notably David Lloyd George, who was Prime Minister from 1916 to 1922. However, we should note here that Maundy Gregory wasn't actually formally a member of staff for a Prime Minister. He was just someone with connections, a rather shady character who had managed to insert himself between the Prime Minister and people who wanted honours and were willing to pay for them, and thereby obtain financial benefits for himself in the process. But it's significant here that we have someone who was actually successfully convicted for selling honours, which is seemingly a very difficult thing to do. The securing the prosecution, I should say, is the difficult thing to do. It seems to be harder to do than the actual selling of honours, perhaps. So there we have some precedents. None of them are perfect precedents for what we've seen today and yesterday going on, these issuing of fixed penalty notices, 20 in total and perhaps more to come, to people seemingly at least some of whom work in Downing Street or thereabouts, and who were actually breaking the law in the workplace while doing their job, or perhaps at the end of the working day, or whatever it was precisely that was going on. We've yet to get the full details on this, if we ever will. So that none of the precedents aren't entirely there, but there are some. And I'm going to close by noting that there is a long-term possibility for the office of Prime Minister, the Prime Minister themselves, and the people who work around them to be accused of improper activities, perhaps including extending as far as breaking the law, as being criminals, as meriting prosecution. Hasn't really happened much, as we've seen, but the possibility that the suspicion is there. And we can find this if we go right back to the person often known as the first ever Prime Minister. It's not as simple as that, and that's something I'll get onto in another recording. But the person is often regarded as having created the office of Prime Minister is Sir Robert Walpole. During his time as First Lord of the Treasury, his second term in that office, in fact, but from 1721 to 1742. Walpole's political management technique included the use of money, such as what was called the Secret Service money, in order to obtain political support from people, whether in the localities around the country or in Parliament. He also engaged in things like giving people sinecure posts, which were a way by which they could earn money without necessarily having to do any work. And all of this was directed towards keeping him in power, getting the business he needed to get through Parliament, and securing whatever his policy objectives were at the time. Walpole eventually lost office early in 1742, felt he'd lost the support of the House of Commons that he needed. In the following March 1742, Parliament established a committee of secrecy made up of MPs and peers that was given the job of investigating Walpole's financial malpractice during his time in office. It went to great lengths to try and uncover evidence that could be used to mount a prosecution, and it even uncovered witness testimonies of people handing over envelopes stuffed full of cash to candidates in elections in coffee houses, and various allegations and insinuations. But it met with difficulties in actually getting people who had worked for Walpole or had supported him in these activities to give evidence to incriminate him or perhaps themselves in the process. And even though at this stage Parliament was willing to use its power to lock people up who didn't comply, and they did this in this case, don't use that power any longer, even though some people might argue they theoretically still have it, even though the parliamentary inquiry was willing to go to those lengths, it just couldn't get the evidence it needed to actually prosecute someone. So while it saw it accumulated evidence of considerable amounts of money being used for improper political purposes, for securing the election of candidates, and also for payment to journalists and for setting up of pro-government newspapers, all these kind of activities, it couldn't really pin anything on anyone. So in the end, it ran out of steam, gave up, and didn't actually manage to secure the prosecution of Walpole they'd hoped for. So this is perhaps a lesson that although we may see a lot of activity in and around prime ministers and their staffs that looks problematic, in the end, these things tend to get resolved politically rather than legally. And I suspect in the end that's what's going to happen today.